Welcome to the Treatment-Free Beekeeping Podcast. It's good to have you back again. Got another episode for you today. Sorry for the long fall-winter hiatus. There's just not much happening in the beekeeping world through the fall and winter here in the Northern Hemisphere. But I'm back with another episode, just freshly recorded. A young man in Central California on the coast who's into beekeeping, who's an agriculture student, and we had a great, wide-ranging conversation, lots of topics, lots of stuff about commercial beekeeping, for and against, let's be fair, and here it is. So your name is Marcel?
Yes, my name is Marcel. I live in San Luis Obispo, California. I study crop science, particularly in the areas of pesticide applications related to pollination and fruit production.
So how did you get into beekeeping?
So my grandfather was a beekeeper, and I actually never met the guy, but when I was 12, there was a school project, and I decided I wanted to do bees, and I just kind of took off from there. But at the very beginning, I got packages, not knowing how to really get started and thinking packages was the only way to go. And lo and behold, they had really bad nosema issues, and it fostered this interest with the way that bees interact with biotic and abiotic pressures within the colony. So I've been working on that for years now and looking for mite resistance in bees, and saw your work, and I've always appreciated it. So I'm happy to be here.
Great. So are you doing any official research or just home stuff?
Not yet. I've always just been doing commercial pollination with other people and doing like private contracting through my own company and raising queens and testing them. And yeah, it's, being a supposedly treatment independent or miticide independent beekeeper in Central California can be a little bit rough because of the influx of commercial colonies. But, it's something that needs to happen, and I find a lot of joy in doing it. But, yeah.
So why don't you tell me, just kind of expand on all the stuff you do down there. Tell me about yourself, and you mentioned your company,
Yeah, sure. So my first year in college, I wanted to get back into bees. I'd taken a break for 2 years, and so I decided to do a little queen trial because I wanted to work on mite resistance, and that was something I knew I really wanted to do. So I set up a whole bunch of colonies, tested queens, and I found the queens that did the best in my area. And I think I actually reached out to you at that time and asked you a few things. But anyway, so I'd been doing that trial for a few years, and I kind of found which queen lines did the best in my area. And my operation started to grow. I think last year I was at like 150 colonies, and then winter, and I knew I just couldn't afford to feed the colonies, and also looking at the amount of mite pressures that I was looking for resistance to, I wanted to have a good control. So right now I'm at about 30-ish colonies at 5 different locations up and down the coast, ranging in about a 50-mile area. And the main point of my operation is that I'm following a rain shadow that happens in the San Luis Obispo area over the Santa Lucia mountain range, which is right behind the town of San Luis Obispo. So, yeah, I run a little beekeeping operation. I do some pollination for organic farmers and some seed companies, and I'm a student and, trying to navigate the world of, or the ever-changing world of crop production, and it's quite interesting.
Tell me about the beekeeping environment down there.
So we're in a chaparral landscape. We're not quite warm. Okay, it'd be easiest for me to talk about the crops that we grow here. We grow a lot of wine grapes, and we grow a lot of avocados. Those are the two main crops that we grow here, along with some citrus. We're not like Santa Barbara in the sense that we do get frosts. We're very close to Paso Robles, which is a pretty famous wine growing area here in Central California, where there's a lot of very large vineyards. Coastal California, in particular, we have these 10-year droughts, and we get these couple really good years for sage, and everybody comes in with semi trucks and they take advantage of the sage, and so you'll get these massive sage crops every couple of years, and then it'll just go bust for another 10. And that's kind of the beekeeping economy here in San Luis Obispo, is people looking to get some sage honey in and doing some citrus pollination, and then going to the almonds. We're about an hour and a half from Fresno or Kettleman City, where we grow a lot of almonds. And it's a little town right on the coast, and San Luis Obispo is this amazing epicenter for beekeeping, in the sense that we're right on the one, and we're close to Highway 5, which is where a lot of the almond production is centered in California.
So do you have a lot of, other than that 10-year cycle, do you have a lot of commercial bees coming in there?
Yeah, there's, I would say, at least 20 commercial operations in our area, ranging from, we have the Adi family here, so that's the largest beekeeping operation in the world, going from like 100,000-ish hives all the way down to mom and pop beekeepers that have 1,000 colonies. And that's kind of, it seems like everybody wants to be in San Luis Obispo, and I can understand it. I think it's a very vital environment to the overall commercial beekeeping industry. But it's a huge range. One would be really amazed if one was able to find all the beekeepers in this area. I think a lot of beekeepers forget about the fact that we might do our business for years and years on end and not realize that there's been another person in the valley right next to us that we've never met, we've never spoken to. They're doing exactly the same thing. They're going through exactly the same issues, but we'll never be able to talk to them, or they don't even have a website, or, it's this interesting dynamic within beekeeping as a whole, is that we don't really talk to each other on the same level. And how much of that is due to the segregation of this industry relating to treatment-free versus not treatment-free versus the way that you keep a bug in a box, essentially. We find so many good ways to argue about something that is seemingly bizarre. If you think fundamentally what beekeeping is, we're keeping bugs in boxes, but it's something that I love to do. But anyways, I don't know where I was going with that. I think what I was trying to say is that we do a really good job of separating ourselves from people doing exactly the same thing that we could really benefit from talking to and learning from.
Well, tell me about that. Do you have resistance to what you do? Excuse me.
Do you mean the bees themselves, or the resistance to...
The resistance to your methods. You're in an area with a lot of commercial beekeepers. Is there arguments back and forth?
So that's a really good question, and I think it really relates to the question that you posed on Facebook that kind of spawned this conversation. And what was that? Do you have that original question that you could ask?
Let me look it up.
Because I think it would be very important for the listeners to know what the essential question was that kind of prompted this whole thing. But what I can say right now while you're looking that up is, beekeeping is, it's very rewarding. It can also be very difficult at times. And the challenge is one of the reasons why I continue to do it, is because I love a good challenge. And there's been many times where one can question whether it's worth trying to keep bees without some sort of cultural aid. And
I found a question you posted back in 2017 about your research project. I don't think that's it.
That's funny. I don't have any doubt of the worth of my projects and the things that I'm trying to breed bees for. I think it's something that needs to be done. I know it's something that'll pay off, even if it's not something that's going to be like fiscally beneficial to me. It's going to pay off for the environment as a whole. And, modern farming, we don't really consider the value of the health of the soil or the health of the ecosystem or of the crops that you have. We only care about yield. And I think there's a lot more to be said with beekeeping than just yield and having 20 framer hives in February, which is it serves its purpose within the agricultural community as a whole, but from a biological perspective, a honeybee doesn't necessarily benefit from doing that. So going back to the main point is it is challenging to be a person looking for resistance within honeybees, but it's something I know that needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And I do it without any doubt because I know it's the right thing to do. And going back to why I wanted to have this conversation in the first place was we do things on a daily basis that are really devoid of scientific evidence as to why we should do them, but it feels like the right thing to do. And I think within the treatment-free community, a lot of the people doing it do it because it seems like it's the right thing to do. They feel like it's the right thing to do. Whether it's an economically viable thing to do, that's a whole nother conversation. And you look at like Randy Oliver's work and a lot of beekeepers that are trying to incorporate mite resistance and tolerance within their production system. I don't think that it's replicating nature very much at all. I think a very important part of nature is having a control. And in a treatment-free breeding program, if you do not have a control and you don't have hives crashing and supposedly being a mite bomb to your other colonies, how do you really know that your hives are resistant? And you look at what Baton Rouge has done with their breeding program for the Russian bees that they started back in 1998. They've been using inoculated colonies that they derive the mites from Italian colonies, and they've been growing these things. And you look at a treatment-free operation, people might not be able to completely understand what they're doing and articulate every single step, but there's so much value in having colonies that are a host and are a inoculation source for pest pressures in a breeding program. That you need to have those controls in order to accurately and realistically breed bees that are able to tolerate stresses like that.
Was the post about, was it the one I posted February 8th talking about science and treatment-free beekeeping?
Yes, that's exactly it. And I really liked it. So I looked at it like pretty soon after it came out, and I said, this is a great post. And I'm not going to say anything because I just want to wait and see it. But everybody else started liking it. And I felt like everybody was just kind of like seeing this giant statue in the road and just like walking around it and not acknowledging that this is the quintessential question to why people argue over treatment free so much. It's like, this is the reason why there's chat rooms and why people at bee conferences start yelling. And I mean, only people in my local clubs have started yelling over treatment free, not at a conference.
I've never been yelled at a conference. I've been yelled at lots of times in various ways through text, through Facebook, through email, all that sort of stuff. But in person, everybody's generally fairly nice.
Yeah. The question with proving if treatment-free beekeeping works is, I look at it kind of like the whole the way that we look at vaccination towards children, I think we look at it in a sense that as a whole, releasing a vaccine to a population of things that are highly developed, intelligent creatures, which are humans, it's something that we need to do. But if you try to relate that to beekeeping, when do we draw a line? When do we choose to address an issue that is going to be consistently perpetuated if we try to treat for it? And I think in many ways we've completely exaggerated the issue of mites in the first place by treating for the last 20 years.
Well, let me just read the post, and then we can kind of dig into it a little bit more. I said, friends, I've been thinking about some things lately, specifically science. I'm often challenged to prove treatment-free beekeeping works scientifically. I have struggled with this because it doesn't make sense. How should I prove conceptually what I've been doing practically and literally for 16 years? Laying awake tonight, I realized something. Claims require evidence. By demanding that one prove treatment-free works, one is actually making the assumption that natural selection does not apply to beekeeping, and that is by far the more dubious claim which requires evidence. In response, they say, all untreated bees died out when Varroa was introduced. Again, where's the evidence? Because there are many beekeepers who kept bees through the introduction of Varroa in an unbroken line. My uncle did it, D. Lesby did it, even before Africanized honeybees showed up. Untreated bees are the control, the initial condition, the default. You don't get to say prove treatment-free works. You need to prove that it doesn't. You need to prove that natural selection does not apply. You need to prove that all colonies die without treatment. You need to prove that everything we know about adaptation in biology is wrong. Treatment-free beekeeping is the control condition. It is the no-treatment group. It is the standard by which all other conditions are tested.
Good question. Where do you want to dive in first on this? I feel like we're trying to attack an elephant.
Well,
it is the elephant in the room.
It is, because there's a sort of thing about humanity where we sort of assume that the way things are now is the way things always were. You know, one of the sort of obvious things from history is that if you go back into the Middle Ages or, you know, that time, and you look at religious artwork of the time, and they would have, they would show pictures of Jesus and his disciples in middle-aged dress. Whereas we all know now that people living in the 1st century in Israel dressed a bit differently than people living in the 14th century in Europe. And a lot of the things that the cultural things, the political things that I like to look at now, you know, we assume the sort of standard political ideologies that are now are universal and throughout history. And really the sort of milieu that we're living in right now is really only about 40 years old. And the same thing with bees. The ideas that we have for treating bees and for bee management in general, a lot of them are 30 years old or less.
True.
You know, mites were only introduced to the United States in the late 80s, early 90s, depending on where you were, depending on how fast they spread. The paradigm has completely changed. One of the fun things that I like to point out is when I started beekeeping, or when I started being interested in beekeeping back in the late 90s when I was a kid, everybody treated for tracheal mites. And then, you know, by the mid 2000s or whatever, nobody was treating for tracheal mites anymore because Varroa got to be such a big problem that everybody just forgot about tracheal mites. And now some people don't even know that they exist.
Do you think that we can get to the point with Varroa with the world at large of just kind of forgetting about it? I mean, you look at like AAA laps. I don't know if that's coming and when it will come. It seems a whole heck of a lot worse than what would happen with Varroa.
I mean, it could, I don't know. It's pure conjecture, but, somebody's going to introduce Varroa to Australia, either on purpose or accidentally. Maybe.
I thought it's already been found there.
Has it?
I'm not completely certain, but.
I'm not sure either, but, somebody, maybe an eco-terrorist or something introduces Tropolaelaps to the United States. But the thing with mites that way, can we just ignore them? And I think a lot of beekeepers already do. The sort of southern crescent across the country from LA to Atlanta, where Africanized bees are already around. Mm-hmm. There's not much concern for Varroa because that's not an issue. One of the fun things for me with starting the treatment-free beekeeping Facebook group is how many people are around the world and especially around the country who don't treat. And, Michael Bush talks about visiting New Mexico and talking about treatment-free beekeeping and not getting a good response from the audience because nobody knew what he was talking about because nobody treated.
Yeah, I think it really has to do with the environment that you were brought into beekeeping with. I think a lot of people started beekeeping on their own, and I would say that my background with beekeeping was really fostered in more of a commercial-oriented environment. So, it's always been kind of like this doom and gloom, like you're going to lose your entire company, you're going to lose your house, your wife, your kids, your car if you don't treat your bees.
Your wife?
She'll leave you. But I never really saw it that way. We treat people tend to fixate on bees and treat them as this completely individualistic entity that is not mirroring what's happened with so many other pests. But I mean, you look at cropping systems, and there's so many vital agricultural crops that at one point we thought we were just going to lose them all. And we were saying it's the end of the world, we're all going to starve. But then we found resistance because with some sort of genetic variation, resistance will develop with time. There are some set situations that resistance would not develop. But I mean that also relates to Varroa. I mean, there's in the very beginning, people were saying that Varroa were like wolves and bees were like sheep, and you cannot breed a
wolf-resistant sheep.
Yeah. But that's completely untrue. I mean, you look at mountain goats, mountain or there's plenty of wild sheep that are pretty wolf resistant. I mean, they live on cliffs, and I don't know. It's I'm getting off track here, but I think what I was saying is resistance will develop. I have faith in it.
What?
As long as you have a pressure.
I don't think you need faith. It's a matter of natural selection. Is the natural law of the universe, as far as we understand. You have a creature that has to where a pest is introduced, a pest or a predator or a parasite in this case, and what happens? This is universal. What happens is there is genetic variation within the population, and some of that genetic variation will allow some of those individuals to survive or survive long enough to reproduce while the other ones aren't reproducing. Those mountain goats that can climb mountains, if you have a mountain goat that can't climb mountains, then he's going to get eaten. Or if he falls, he's going to get eaten. And so over time, you adapt for the mountain goat that can climb up on rocks.
Yeah, exactly.
And the ones that can't climb up on rocks die. Now, the fact that some continue to survive is proof that the genetic variation has allowed, or that proof that the genetic variation works, that that some can survive, and we've seen that with bees. Some can survive. That's the only thing you need to prove. Unless all of them are dead, they can't adapt. And since they aren't all dead, they can adapt. And they have.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to tell me that if you don't treat bees that they'll die, you got to show why that's the case. You got to show why the law of natural selection doesn't apply, because it seems like it does.
I can full-heartedly agree with you there. But if I were to ask a question to like a random person on the street, that we're not talking about bees, we're going to just forget about that for a second, and we're going to say, what is proof that natural selection works? It's like proving something like that. It's like, it's such a large, it's like a very much a meta train of thought. You know, it's like, what is the distinct proof that natural selection works? It's like, when was the last time that someone has tried to prove that in a research trial or whatever, except for Darwin? I mean, Darwin tried to, he wrote books and books and books on that, well over 100 years ago. And he was arguing so adamantly about something that people just did not believe in. And then you try to take that to beekeeping, and you're arguing that bees will evolve. And then people just don't think that that's true. I think that you need to have specific conditions for evolution, but we cannot ignore the idea of evolution.
Well, that's one of the things that I point out about natural selection, is it's not natural in the sense that humans aren't involved. It's natural in the sense that it's what happens, right? If you hold out an object and release it into the air, it will fall naturally. You caused that to happen, but we're talking about the sense of natural in the natural consequences of things, right? Gravity, natural laws. These are not things that aren't affected by humans. Humans affect them. Still, they are natural. Natural selection with bees, you know, I tell people, if you feed bees to keep them alive when they ought to be self-selecting themselves out of the gene pool, if you feed them to keep them alive, you are selecting for bees that need to be fed. If you treat them, you're selecting for bees that need to be treated, because natural selection says that if they don't get that selective pressure, the selective pressure works in the opposite direction. The selective pressure is for whatever causes them to survive.
I think selective breeding related to feeding of honeybees is really, really interesting, and I don't think that people are really giving it enough credit or enough airtime, in the sense of, you know, we talk about these drought conditions in Texas or in Florida or in California, or essentially any vital bee economy, and no one's selecting for drought resistance or frugality within honeybees anymore. You know, we've been, like, if you look at the Italian honeybee, it's been bred exactly in the opposite direction, to be as excessive and extravagant as possible, and completely devoid of shifts in environmental condition. And that's something that I've been working on, is looking at bees that can do more with less. And, you know, last year, it's when you have so many beehives and you're on a fixed income, and you ask yourself, am I actually going to be able to recoup the cost if I go out and spend $5,000 on sugar over the course of 4 months? And I was very frank with myself, and I said, I have no means to recoup that cost. So, I mean, it wasn't pretty to watch, but I watched many, many colonies just starve out. But I'm really excited to see what's going to happen this year, especially since we're in drought. I know which ones of my colonies are able to get by with less. And I think that's such a vital thing. But that also relates to natural selection, and that's a part of beekeeping that has been completely forgotten recently, because we're going in a completely different operation. Do you look for frugality within your hives at all? Like, how do you select for that?
That's exactly the way that you select for anything in your local area, just by leaving them alone. You know,
Yeah.
I the only time I feed bees is when I really want or need them to survive for a specific reason. You know, like this last year, I made a bunch of splits, and then I went and broke my back and couldn't do anything. So they didn't get supered, they didn't get built up, nothing happened. And so when they went into winter, they were had nothing to work with, and it wasn't their fault. And so I fed them. And so this year, the goal is to build up all the hives at the right time and not leave them, you know, allow them to do what they need to do to get what they need to do done so they can survive on their own. And then optimally, I wouldn't feed at all, because I want those hives to be adapted to this area, which means they need to brood up at the right time to collect all the honey that they need to survive for the winter, and all those other aspects that you can kind of lump into that grand concept. And that's frugality, that's timing of buildup, that's all sorts of measures of vigor, honey collection, you know, all the stuff.
I think you know, I never really thought about it in the beginning when I started looking for resistance and tolerance to mite issues in particular, and just general disease. But I think frugality is one of my favorite traits because it encompasses so much. Like, I mean, of course, like Varroa is a quantitative trait, unless you're looking at VSH, which is qualitative. But you know, we're looking at frugality, and you're looking at like bees that are able to forage at lower temperatures, and they're more aware of their environment. It's such a beautiful thing. And I mean, maybe only I can say that, but for someone that lives in a place where a 10-year drought is like a really realistic thing to expect, and people are selling queens everywhere, you know, knowing that I could potentially save hundreds of dollars by having the right queen in a hive over the course of years is a really beneficial concept. But the point where I kind of get a little bit blurry in my philosophy with that is when you're raising the queens. Like, how do you want to be? Is it worthwhile to feed the colony while you're trying to raise those queens when you're in the cell builder and the finisher, and then when you're in the mating nook and everything? And I think so much of the treatment-free community, it's like we kind of ignore this issue about feeding necessarily, but I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
No, you make some good points. Optimally, we work with nature, right? We do all of our queen rearing and everything in sync with the natural blooms so that we don't have to feed, because, you know, queens during a dearth, a virgin queen might not fly out and mate. And you would need to feed in that situation, or else she'll never mate, and you'll have a queenless hive. But optimally, you know, I really got good at this back in Arkansas. I haven't really gotten good at it yet. I'm getting better here in Oregon. But back in Arkansas, I had it down to a science where I could go through 3 or 4 rounds of queen rearing without having to feed anything and without running into the summer dearth. And that was a lot of fun, being able to be successful that way, being able to find out how all that worked and work through it. But here I'm still trying to learn things, which is part of the reason why I had those small hives this last year, that I made splits too late. But there's also, you talk about selling queens around everywhere, and that's something that I've been really trying to, well, I'm one of those people who's out there offering my opinion all the time, and so I'm sort of arguing against that. And because of lately the thing that I've been recommending is there's a video by John Chambers. It's like beekeeping genetics. I post it all the time on the Facebook group. Surely people have.
Yeah, that was the one in England, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things he talks about is when you move bees to different areas, they get out of sync with the flows of things. And
yeah,
so
I know that one.
One of the issues is that you get what's called outbreeding depression, where you take bees that are well adapted to one area, move them to a different area, and they interbreed. And now you've got bees, both the ones you've moved, the descendants of the ones you've moved, and the descendants of the original ones that were there are now out of sync with the environment because they've had genetics imported from somewhere else. And I keep reminding people that in nature, bees aren't meant to move, right? Swarms that swarm away from a colony will go at the very maximum within a couple of miles of the home colony, right? They're going to end up in the same valley where they are. Here we've got lots of mountains and valleys. You've got lots of mountains and valleys, I assume.
Yes.
Swarms don't fly over mountain passes generally. The reason why we have Italian bees and Caucasian bees and Carniolan bees is because after the last ice age, these populations, these subspecies of honeybees were separated by mountain ranges in Europe for thousands of years, and they developed these subspecies with different traits that were specifically adapted to those areas, and they were separated by mountain ranges. This is how bees evolved. It's how they're meant to work. They're not meant to be trucked across the country and around the country in circles every year. It's just, they're not meant to be shipped in the mail. I can order a queen from New York. I can order a queen from Texas, Florida, wherever. And those bees are going to be like those Italians. They're high performance, right? But they can't survive without the support that they need because they brood up at the wrong time. They can't deal with disease. They keep burning stores in the winter when they should be clustering and hibernating. And they're just not fit for any specific area unless you put all these inputs into them. And it's my theory that the more you do that, eventually you just get to the point where everything dies. It's like what we have with our monoculture. The reason all of our tomatoes are the same size and the same color and they're not bruised even though they've gone through multiple layers of machines to pack them and pick them and all that stuff is because they've been so inbred to be exactly perfect and durable and to be harvested on the same day. Every tomato in the field has to be ripe on the same day so we can harvest them and ship them off to wherever. But they're so genetically narrow and inbred that if there was a disease, you wipe out an entire species, entire production of food, like what happened with the potato famine in Europe. Yeah. If you don't have that genetic diversity within your population, you are susceptible to things like CCD and potato famine. And right now there's a big disease moving through the entire world population of bananas. So it's the genetic diversity is necessary and bees are really good at it. And if you limit it too much, my case is they just die. And that's what we've seen here and there.
I think that's a really good point. We talk about, you look at the biology of the honeybee, and the honeybee is designed to maximize genetic diversity and fitness at all costs. But then you look at a breeding scheme or a breeding pool or a breeding program, and the whole point is that you're trying to exaggerate traits. And you look at that with like VSH, or you look at SMR, or let's just say any Varroa tolerance or resistant trait. And that's a really interesting aspect of bee genetics, is that you don't know when you've inbred them too much, or we don't necessarily know the consequences of it. Rudolf Steiner was having a conversation with a beekeeper, actually a beekeeper named Mueller, like 100 years ago. And Rudolf Steiner was arguing about how grafting queens would be the demise of honeybees as a whole. And I graft. I think grafting is an amazing tool. You can essentially photocopy honeybees, and that's really cool. But I also do think that there is some sort of limitation to causing a bottleneck or a replication of set genes within the apiary. And as a beekeeper, I know that having diversity and having some hives crash of different gene types is going to directly benefit my apiary as a whole, because I know which ones are not going to be able to survive, and I know which ones are going to be able to survive and deal with that. But you were talking about the mountain ranges a few minutes ago, and I was in a canyon yesterday. I went for this hike right behind one of my bee yards. I went up this, I climbed up about 1,400 feet, and then I dropped back down to above. I mean, I was above sea level to begin with, so I just went a little. I basically went up this giant hill and then came back down into a canyon. And everybody's at almond pollination right now. I know this for a fact because I could see all the other apiaries around my apiary site where other beekeepers are, and all their hives are gone. But I'm seeing a ton of honeybees drinking some spring water that's coming down this hillside, and I'm looking at the different colorations of them. And just because we expect honeybees to be separated by a mountain range or unable to survive because they were a release of a commercial stock doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily die immediately. They might survive for a number of years. And you look at the genetic diversity of a honeybee, like they go out and mate how many miles do you think a drone goes out and mates, Solomon?
I've heard so many different numbers. It's one of those things like I don't think about that.
I don't think about it. And then people talk about queen mating, like virgins mating with anywhere from 6 to 100 queens. And 6 to 100 drones. And I don't even know what to think about that. I don't question it. I don't think about it. I acknowledge that they mate with a whole bunch of different things very, very far away. But going back to this whole beehive in a canyon thing, in any environment, there will always be some little niche or some swarm that escapes and flies away. And how much of that, specifically in California, is aided in some degree by the introduction of Scutellata into our honeybees and allowing them to drift farther into canyons or drift into areas that have really, really bad forage conditions for an Italian honeybee, but relatively excellent conditions for an Africanized honeybee. I don't know. But I always think that there will be some honeybee living in the woods, regardless of whether humans are here or not, all over since we've introduced them. Seeley might think that his forest is one of the epicenters of genetic isolation of honeybees, but I think they're everywhere, and we just cannot forget that. Even if there are commercial beekeepers coming in on semi-trucks, there will always be that one beehive that flies a little, that one queen that'll fly a little higher, a little faster, and a little farther to mate with drones and keep her own gene lines.
Well, that's what the science says, is that the feral bees actually affect the commercial bees more than the other way around. Because, because is my conjecture, but it's because they're more fit. It's because they are surviving in an area where escaped swarms from the commercial bees can't ultimately survive because they're not adapted to it. They can't survive without being fed and being treated. And as far as the thing that I came up with Tom Seeley, I have nothing against Tom Seeley personally, but
Neither do I. I think his work is amazing, and I would give him a hug, and I'd buy him a beer if he was right here.
Sure.
Yep.
But he just happens to have this nice little forest with feral bees right near where he is. That's so convenient, you know. What if he'd gone to school in Southern California? Would he just be out of luck on feral bees?
No, he would not be. I mean,
no, they're everywhere.
They're everywhere. I mean, you go to Death Valley, or you go to Joshua Tree, and you're in this cactus garden, and they have like all these signs of warning signs about honeybees everywhere. It's because there's honeybees everywhere. I think you could start an amazing breeding program if you were to put beehives in the middle of Joshua Tree National Park. You could get some crazy genetics coming out of there.
I have found wild bees. There's a big wild area south of where I am. If you're looking at it on a map, if you look at where I-5 takes a western turn through Medford in Southern Oregon, and then heads north again, if you take that sort of the arc between Wairika and Grants Pass and sort of draw a circle around it, just make that half of a circle, that much of that area is completely wild. And I've been up there in a couple of different places along the Pacific Crest Trail, along the border of California. And there are, in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, that's over on the eastern side of I-5. There's bees up there, miles and miles away from humans, up at 5,000 feet. In the Klamath National Forest, there's bees up there. I've found them. I've seen them. Like, you can't tell me that all the bees died because I've seen them.
I mean, we could all just say that you're crazy and that you're seeing things, but I believe you.
I have pictures.
I've seen them myself. I might be out there wearing my tinfoil hat, but I've seen bees in the wild, and I know they exist. You see honeybees in places where no beekeeper in their right mind would try to haul a pickup truck, or
nobody would want to put bees up there because there's not much forage.
I mean, there's not much forage at all.
And there's snow on the ground from, October until March. A lot of my listeners are from like the northern Midwest regions where that's normal also, but it's not really normal for us except for at high altitudes.
Yeah, to all those northern Midwestern beekeepers who can't get into their beehives, stay strong. I'm in California. I have no understanding of what that's like. We work bees year round. We can graft in January if we really had to.
Wow.
But that actually was something that happened this year for the first time with some commercial beekeepers in my areas, that they were grafting in January. And I thought it was complete nonsense, but apparently they made it. So
it was a little cold here last night. It's colder than it has been. It was 24 degrees last night. It was very frosty. But it's currently 36, and we'll probably get up in the mid to high 40s. So we do have a winter. Can't graft. I just kind of leave the bees alone. Probably have a few flyers out today when it's hot, when it's the hottest. So we do have a winter. But a couple years ago, I did an interesting month where I was speaking almost every weekend, and I went from Wisconsin in, I think it was the month of March. Anyway, Wisconsin, and there was like huge chunks of ice next to the river where the river had been frozen over, and all these chunks of ice stacked up. And then I went down to Tulsa where it was like 75 degrees, like the next weekend. So it was an interesting experience to be all over the country. So I was in Arizona, Wisconsin, Oklahoma. Where was I? Was I in Virginia that year also? Anyway, I was all over the place, and it was interesting to see the different weather at basically the same month.
That sounds quite interesting. So going to I was thinking about Dee Ludsby for a second. She would make walkaways in January, right?
I assume so. It's been so long since I've read that.
That's so interesting. I've always wondered about beekeeping in Arizona specifically. Like how many of those cacti are actually night blooming. So.
Yeah, night blooming, and also they have like 2 rainy periods. Or I was just at the Saguaro National Forest just around New Year's, and reading the information about the rainy periods. There's like 2 rainy periods, one in the spring and one in the fall, or winter. I don't remember. I'm probably screwing it all up, but basically, yeah, they keep bees year round. It does get pretty cold at night there, but I've been there several times in March. And, it's typically 70 to 80 degrees in the daytime, even if it gets pretty cold at night.
I was talking to Sam Comfort at a conference once, and he was telling me about how he wanted to make this little, expandable train track system to keep his mating nooks or something, warm at night so that he could haul them out during the day and at a specific time in order to get them to mate with a set population after all the drones of another population had gone away. And that was really interesting because I knew there was a bee breeder in Phoenix at one point. I think this is prior to the ban on taking mated queens out of Arizona for sale. But he was actually keeping his mating nooks indoors and then taking them out during the day. So he was mating queens in December, and that was amazing. But
yeah, it's a different world.
It's different.
Down to southern Florida. I went down and visited southern Florida a year and a half ago, and they keep bees year round. I mean,
oh yeah,
they're always on the Facebook group. They're always posting cutouts all year long. They're doing cutouts. I mean, there's just never an end of. I was also in Eureka, California, which is not that far. It's only, I think, 4 hours south from here. And, they only need to, they can keep bees, they can have a full yearly cycle of beekeeping in just a deep and a medium. They just, harvest a few frames every month or so. And even though it's fairly cold there, it's typically doesn't get much higher than 65 in the daytime. But even through winter, it's still that same temperature. And so you still have things blooming and still keeps going.
Yeah, it's trying to retrain yourself when you're kind of taught how to be a commercial beekeeper and how to be a more realistic and natural beekeeper. I always have this scheme in the back of my mind that I'm going to get some early queens and triple my production and my hive numbers and do all this crazy stuff, but at the end of the day, there's very little benefit to that, and it's a whole lot of work for minimal ROI to do such a thing. Especially when you're looking at resistance and drought conditions. It's I'm just going to produce a whole bunch of hives that are going to starve and not be that great of a queen.
We were talking about grafting. I love grafting. Grafting is a fantastic way to make a lot of queens really fast with limited resources. But you have to compensate for the artificial reproduction. A normal hive will swarm once, maybe twice a year, maybe more, depending on what type of bees you have. But for most of us, once or twice a year, and that's all the reproduction it gets. But when you take that one queen and now you're making 30 daughters off of that queen, you're losing some of the selective pressure for fast hatching queens. But the first time you have a supersedure or a swarm, you'll get that selection back. And the same thing with selection for disease. The first time you go through a disease problem, a Varroa hit or whatever, you'll get that selection back. And so by massively increasing, I could be wrong. Somebody tell me if I'm wrong. I'm sort of just speeding up the natural selection process by shortcutting part of it. There is a price to pay for that, selection-wise, but I think it's worth it, and that price is paid fairly quickly. And overall, I think overall it's a win.
See, I'm at this very interesting point with my breeding project. I went from this relatively large gene pool, and then I know which ones are my breeder colonies now. I feel very confident that a set number of them are breeder colonies, but it would be so painful for me to have to graft from every single one of them because I want to maintain these gene lines. And this year, I think just because of time constraints with school and everything, I'm going to just do a lot of walkaways, and maybe my success will be lower, but I'm really excited to maintain these different gene lines. And I don't know his name, but there's some guy in Oregon. He has an Instagram account called like Digging Living or something, and he uses a lot of redwood hives, and he's like a more naturalistic beekeeper. But he talks about the beauty of and the worth of doing walkaways and doing like self-raised queens. You're maintaining all these gene lines, and relating that to like the super sisters and the subfamilies within a beehive that a grafter is completely unaware of when they're grafting larvae. I wonder about that a lot. I've looked at colonies that I've let produce their own queens, and I've seen a significantly higher success rate and their ability to withstand Varroa. I don't know how much of that is just because of maybe the queens were of lower quality when I grafted them myself versus the ones that they raised on their own. But I think there's something to be said for having self-raised queens. And I know that Michael Bush talks about diversity of queens that are raised on their own. What do you think about that?
I have given less and less credence to any sort of breeding or gene lines or any of that lately. Bees are so, like you said earlier, so well designed to maintain genetic diversity, to mix up genes so with such fine resolution. I think really the best way, the most efficient way is just to let them go, to graft off of that 1, 2, 3, 5 hives that you like and just let them ride. Ultimately I try to think more on a population level dynamic. So population level dynamic is, thinking of all the bees in the area. If I'm dealing with my bees, some of them are surviving, some of them are dying. This is part of the natural process. It just seems to me that it's so much more efficient to leave them be, because the genetic recombination with honeybees is so strong that it's hard to maintain anything more than a generation or two. Even the best bred VSH queens, more than a generation or two after the original, and they just kind of revert back to the normal. And I think that's what we actually need to be looking for, is that reversion to the mean, because that mean is the population level dynamic, is what allows the species to survive. It's what maintains the genetic diversity and allows them to survive and adapt relatively quickly, no matter where they're put. That probably didn't answer your question, but
no, it might not have answered my question, but it brought about a very good point, which is, talking about why to try to uphold increased genetic diversity when we know that they're going to be so genetically diverse based on even if you graft 100 from the same colony. But my thought with that is if the bees are designed to be diverse on their own, why not try to make them even more diverse and just completely run with them, don't try to fight the bees anymore. That's what I've learned it's only been like 10-ish years with bees now, but stop trying to fight them. Just keep on running with them, and they do better that way.
It's so interesting to me that there's all this effort in breeding to make this bee that's super high performance. Stays, that Italian ideal. They brood all the time. They produce bees all the time, which is good for pollination. And then they bring in loads of honey. And you can do that. The problem is they just don't survive on their own very well. And I want bees, I broke my back this last year. I was in bed for 2.5 months. Could not lift anything for well beyond that. So I basically, I ended up having to have people carry out some honey syrup for me in September so that I could feed them in September, just cause they had nothing. And, but for the most part, 6 months, they got no care whatsoever. And that's the kind of beekeeping that I want to do. I want to be interactive with the feral population. I want my bees to be functionally no different than the feral population, except for maybe I'm breeding them to be a little gentler and a little more productive as far as producing honey. But I want them to do that honey production without stimulation and without feeding them to help them survive over winter. And the only way you can do that is by having them adapted to your area so that they are hitting every flow perfectly. They're brooding up at the right time, they're shutting down at the right time, and everything's in. But you can't do that by buying a queen from, I don't know, Kona, or I got my original packages from Conan, which is down in Orland, California.
Yeah, I'd like to say that Kona raises great queens. Conans raise great queens if they're in the right setting. For a person that is running them as hard as I am, they would fall apart quite quickly. But those people are really good at what they do. But going back to what you were saying, and being bedbound or whatever, trying to find a bee that works with your life, that's such an important thing. And I think there's something to be said for, if you have an operation, let's say, that has 6,000 hives, and something happens to you, your whole business is just going to fall apart. And I've seen this happen on a smaller scale than that, but when something happens to your life, whether your kid gets sick, or your truck goes out, or you need to do your taxes and you're a small business owner, that affects your bottom line in such a huge way. And I don't think that honeybees are really designed with the beekeeper's life in mind anymore, and it's become such a stressful thing. Seeing that and working for multiple beekeepers, my whole company plan kind of turned into this upside down triangle, where the first thing I wanted to do was find a honeybee that could fit my life and I had more faith in, so that as I get larger, I know that I can walk away, I can go on vacation every once in a while, and sometimes you might get a little bit sick of beekeeping, or you might you might just need to take a little break. And I think beekeepers are really bad at giving themselves rest and recovery. That's such a healthy, important part of every other industry, but beekeepers are just like working themselves to the bone nonstop. And we find a lot of camaraderie in that, but is that sustainable? No.
Well, that's
been my whole point.
That's sort of ultimately American also.
Yeah.
I was looking at some numbers the other day about the difference between work time and leisure time for Americans and other nationalities. And we actually broadly don't have less leisure time than, say, European countries, but we have so much less self-care time, eating time, chilling out time, talking to people time. Instead of taking a long lunch and a nap for lunch, we eat as quickly as possible and get back to work. And so we remove a lot of that self-care, the joy of life, we sort of ignore for the sake of production. And so, I totally hear you.
Keeping bees is supposed to be fun, It's like, why do something if you don't love it? And we look at these blog posts for other countries that are talking about how they raise queens or whatever, and they're like, this is me having lunch. I'm drinking my local hard cider and eating a brie sandwich. And, Americans, we don't do that. Like, we we don't take breaks like that. I've never seen that happen in a bee yard.
Let's have a picnic.
Yeah, I want to have more picnics in beekeeping. Put the picnic back in beekeeping. But yeah,
it's there's so much that we've lost. At the same time, it can be depressing to see how much we've lost in agriculture with factory farming. Almonds are massive, just factory farming operation. And the beekeeping industry now is largely subservient to that. And I think that's terrible. But there are also lots of positives. Organic farming, small scale organic farming is more popular than ever. They are attempting to develop self-pollinating almond trees. So, I would expect within the next 20 or 30 years, maybe even a decline in the honeybee migration because of self-pollinating almonds.
Yeah, Solomon, you're talking about this is like the core of my identity as a person, is like my interest with almond pollination and with beekeeping and organic farming. And it's such an interesting dynamic that we've created. It's almost like beekeepers have become drug addicts to this quick money that happens because of almond pollination, and bees have just been the canvas of that in many ways. And I've been to almond growing and almond breeding facilities, and self-fertile almonds are not that far away. I mean, they're 10 years out. So as a young beekeeper, one, it's very demoralizing to see all these people burning themselves out, working so hard for something that I know it's just going to spit them out because they are an accessory. They are an overhead cost that can be easily cut out with selective breeding of almonds. But there's something also very important about having bees within agriculture and having an ecosystem. And the ecosystem is so fragmented that beekeeping is migratory now in so many aspects. We talk about I was sitting down with like Brett Adi once, and he was telling me about the toxicity of almonds and the toxicity of the Central Valley and how to be a good beekeeper. And one of the ways to be a best beekeeper is just judge your climate and be realistic with yourself and know when to just haul ass out of a place if your bees are doing poorly. And that's something that is so much more frequent in commercial beekeeping, is when you just have to cut and run.
I have a question.
Sure.
I have been dubious toward the idea that a treatment-free commercial migratory bee could be developed. I think the natural selection possibility is there. If you just stopped treating and just worked with the bees that survived, it would be possible. My question is, that whole process is so stressful. Would any bees survive?
Realistically, the answer is no. And I don't think that any creature should ever be forced to undergo such stressful mechanisms. Like, Solomon, if you were a bee, imagine being locked up in a truck for 4 days and driving through rain, snow, desert, and then being stuck at a truck stop in like Needles, California for 6 hours while like some state entomologist like stares at this one beetle that they don't understand what it is, but it's actually a beetle that just got on in the last 15 minutes in Arizona, and they're gonna have to like contact 30 people. That's a whole other conversation. But it's not realistic to expect for honeybees to be treatment free, or for any animal to undergo the amount of stress that we put honeybees through, especially in the toxicity of agriculture at the moment. And I'm a young guy, and I definitely do not know everything. I'm learning so much every single day, and I'm grateful for that. And there was definitely a fair amount of being a naive young beekeeper when I started out this project, and it's kind of taken me through these ups and downs and a hero's journey of sorts to come to the conclusion that certain things just cannot be done. And going back to, is treatment-free beekeeping worth it? I think it's totally worth it. I think it's a fundamental aspect of commercial beekeeping is the bee breeder that has to look for these traits that he is going to then pass on to people that are going to dilute them. And hopefully they have an ability to reduce the amount of amitraz or lithium chloride or formic or oxalic or whatever they need to put in their colonies to keep them alive for the next 10 years or whatever, while the almond industry is still good. But things are changing. And as a young agronomist and someone who's going into agriculture, we have to be really, really, really honest with ourselves about where this industry is going. And it can look a little bit bleak, but there's also a lot of beauty in it because it's changing quite quickly. Hopefully it's going towards more environmentally and socially responsible systems, but I don't know. The money is flying in many different directions right now, so hopefully in a good direction, though.
The money is what drives the whole thing.
Yeah, it's all driven by money, but maybe in 20 years we'll go back to a time when we all know our farmer. What will have to happen in order for us to get to that point is a good question. But
and you can do that now.
You can, but you have to go a really long ways. Yeah, and even the people that are trying to know their farmer, that farmer is still struggling really, really hard. Yeah. They're doing their best, and they're still at the mercy of the market. And it's a painful thing, as someone that I've been blessed to work with other beekeepers who were living my dream. And I really looked up to them in the beginning, and I still look up to them in some capacity. But I learned from those beekeepers that a life like that is incredibly difficult, and you can put yourself in certain positions that you're at the mercy of the market, and you're at the mercy of a consumer that is spending their accessory or surplus income on a jar of honey that is a little bit more than or a whole lot more than the honey that they'd buy at the grocery store. And it's hard to live within that little surplus income area, especially when honey is a commodity.
I was realizing the other day how much we are living. You hear things about like we're using more than one Earth's worth of resources right now.
Yeah.
And I was realizing how much of the opulence we live in comes from the expending of fossil fuels, especially. Mm-hmm. So many times I hear people talk about, if the bees died, then we're all going to starve to death. No, that's not what's going to happen. If the bees went away, if we suddenly didn't have these mass factory produced pollinated crops like almonds and apples and blueberries and these sorts of crops, they're not going away. It's not like nobody will ever eat a blueberry again. It's just that the production of blueberries will have to be decentralized to the point where it can be pollinated through native pollinators, and then these things will become seasonal and expensive like they always were up until 50 years ago, and we would have to eat more like our ancestors did throughout history, where we're eating a lot more grains and things that can be stored for a long time, rather than fruits and meats that can't be stored for a long time. So it's not that we would all starve to death. It's that our food, the price of our food, the effort that goes into making our food, the resources would come back into balance such that we would actually care more. But right now everything is so cheap that we really don't care that much.
Yeah, and it's not that the Central Valley or agriculture itself is necessarily the problem. It's, a lot of it has to do with planning. If you were to take the area that is the almond growing capital, or the main almond production area of the world, and you were to, let's say, grow like 100th of the amount of almonds that they're currently growing, and you were to plant other crops that are of value to humans, whether those are legumes or grains or some sort of flour or oil crop, and you were to intercrop those systems together, you could potentially produce a farm site that could host maybe like one thousandth of the amount of honeybees that it currently has, like, year round. So let's say we could still grow almonds, we could still grow blueberries, we could still grow cotton and all these crucial agricultural crops in the Central Valley, but together with a more respectful mechanism for like controlling pests. You could have a year-round healthy environment for a honeybee potentially, but that would take so much planning and so much fragmentation and retraining and re-education of farmers, and it would be highly inefficient. But that's also one of the beauties of automation within agriculture is the potential of having things that are really, really labor intensive, but more sustainable for the pollinators and beneficial insects and wildlife.
I believe it can be done. I think we have the smart people to do it. And even with automation, with the self-driving tractors now, self-driving tractors are already taking over ahead of self-driving cars because there's not many people to run over out in the field. So self-driving tractors are already a reality. So we can automate a lot of this stuff but you're right. It takes a lot of planning and a lot of integration, and you're going to need to plant more than one crop on the same piece of land. And that takes extra thinking and extra work. And maybe somebody who comes up with a sort of a universal plan for that, one row of almond trees and then one row of whatever and then one row of something else and then plant clover all over the ground to keep some blooms in the holdover periods. Somebody comes up with that plan, I think we've got a really winning equation.
Yeah, it's a winning equation, but it also has like aspects of water usage and frost issues. It's a really, really complex thing, and it's something I try to grapple with and wrestle with and try to find a way out of it. But there's really no direct solution at the moment. But going back to the education, I think it's such an important part of beekeeping. I mean, education is important for everything. I think we can all agree about that, whether or not we agree with whether treatment-free beekeeping is scientifically valid or not. Education is a crucial part of beekeeping and of just life. But I think beekeeping is something that people get into because it can be a very addicting and fast-paced thing, especially in the commercial setting. We can kind of pretend like we're cowboys out here in California, just driving around, dropping off loads, going into the middle of nowhere, dropping off a truckload of bees, working them, coming back, picking them up, moving them again. It's like this fast-paced, repetitive thing. You don't really have the time to think about it and relax and think critically about what you're doing. And that is also reflected within agriculture at the moment, is we're not really thinking long term, we're thinking short term with high return, but very little long term sustainability in mind. But yeah, that's the point of being a crop student, is you're trying to think critically about agriculture, and that's such an important skill.
Well, do you have anything else you want to throw in here before we shut her down?
I don't think so. It's been a pleasure being on the show. and have a great day. And thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for the great conversation. I really enjoyed myself. Is there anywhere you want people to be able to get a hold of you if they want to talk to you?
You can find me on Instagram. You can try to find my website. I need to redo my website, but my name is Marcel Mueller, and my new website. I think right now it's just primoqueens.com. PRIMO queens.com. But yeah, I'm not selling queens at the moment, so just bees.
Right on. Well, thanks a lot. I will see you around on the Facebook group, and have a good day.
You too.
All right, that was Marcel. I had a lot of fun. Hope you did too. If you like the podcast a lot and you want to support it, check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/TFB. And we have a bunch of other stuff, Facebook group, YouTube channel. I've got like 130 videos now on the YouTube channel, and a forum also, which is at tfbforum.com. The rest of the stuff, if you just search treatment-free beekeeping or treatment-free beekeepers around, you can find that stuff. Beware of cheap imitations, because there are a couple treatment-free beekeepers groups out there which are not us. So keep track of that. Also, for fun, if you're into permaculture and small-scale farming and things like that, I have started a new Facebook page called Dirtling Farm. That's what I'm calling my little farm here, my new property. And I'm going to be covering all sorts of topics there. Bees, gardening, small scale agriculture, animal husbandry, composting. I love all that sorts of stuff. So if you're into that sort of thing, check that out. Just go to Facebook and search Dirtling Farm, DIRTLING. If you're not, don't worry about it. You don't have to listen to this. This is at the end. You may not be even listening to it now. You might have just skipped it. Or you're waiting till the end until my updated catchphrase. Which is, have fun keeping bees, because if you're not having fun, I suggest watercolors.